And things do become more than a little bit sticky. In fact, they can become downright hostile. Okay, dilemma number 1, the early diagnosis of dementia. Again, when we were in medical school, this was not possible. And even when we got, well, first of all, we didn't learn much about dementia in medical school because it was not a particularly common problem. Things have changed over the past, dare I say, 40 years. You're welcome. She went to medical school at 15. I was 22. You're welcome. This is an important slide that I show almost every time I lecture, because it puts forth why we're looking at what is erroneously called an epidemic of dementia. It's not, it's an epidemic of aging. In 1900, life expectancy was only 48 years. Now granted, infant mortality was high, but not a lot of people lived to be 80 who were born, let's say, before 1900. By 2008, life expectancy was 78 years. And for some groups, such as women, it's even higher than that. And it may be a little bit lower for other groups. More relevant to the problem is what is called additional life expectancy for a particular age. So someone who's 65 today can look forward to about 17 more years of life. Someone who is 85 can look forward to 6, and someone who's 100 can look forward to 2 more years of life. The oldest man in our community, Father Joe Fennell, is 102. Joe's only goal was to live to be the oldest Jesuit in the United States. And the day the man who was 6 months older than him died, Joe was going down the hall in his wheelchair like this. And I also lived with the oldest Jesuit in the world, who died at the age of 105, 1 month and 1 day. And Jimmy and I were from the same tiny hometown in northeastern Pennsylvania, just outside of Wilkes-Barre, Scranton, a little town known as Plymouth. And all of you may have seen Plymouth on television in July of 1968 during the nationally televised event known as Mary Jo Kopechne's funeral. She was from my hometown. And we're the only 2 men who ever entered the society, although he would be about 111 now, so he was a little bit older than me. So we see that people are living longer and can expect to live longer at any particular age. When you hit 65 in 1900, you'd done real well by the average age expectancy. And might have a few more years, but one could no longer assume that there was a very good possibility of hitting the early 80s, if not beyond that. It's like the old Irish saying that I made up one day, every day above ground buys you 2 more. Now, the single greatest risk factor for all forms of dementia, with 1 or 2 very rare exceptions, is age. The longer one lives, the greater the possibility. This is inarguable. The incidence of all forms of dementia from patients 60 to 69 hovers around 1%. But by 90 to 95, it's getting pretty close to 40%. The general rule of thumb that the prevalence doubles every 5 years of age from 60 to 90. So, here's a graph. This is using 3 different forms of graphing the data. Do not ask me to explain statistics. Unlike Marianne, I actually did flunk medical statistics. It was a horrendous re-exam. You see here at the age of 60, the incidence is very low. It almost doesn't fit on the graph, it's so low. But by 80, you're looking at about a 10%, and all the lines seem to cross at around the age of 90 at about 40%. And then depending on how things are plotted, the curves take a slightly different shape. So that the single greatest risk factor for developing any form of dementia is living long enough to do so. Most patients today are diagnosed at some point when problems develop. Behavioral problems, memory problems, getting lost. I think everyone here has a story when I first noticed something might have been wrong. And then when I was certain something was really wrong and decided to seek an evaluation, and then we begin to go through the various tasks of dealing with what's happening. The challenge today is we're getting closer and closer to an early diagnosis. This is a paper that appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine in August of 2012. I skipped lunch to read this one. And it is a paper looking at using the very small number of people who have genetically determined AD, familial AD, where we know that the onset of symptoms for anyone carrying the gene will be at about the same time as the parent. Now, this is not applicable to the vast majority of cases, which are unpredictable. But in this small number, it is. And what the researchers did was to do a number of very complicated studies on bodily fluids from the brain, scanning tests, cognitive tests, to calculate if we could predict before the onset of symptoms when things would happen. The results were interesting. They found that autosomal dominant Alzheimer's inherited was associated with changes over the decades in the cerebrospinal fluid, in the deposition of protein in the brain that could be seen by scans, as well as in tests of cognitive impairment that were apparent up to 20 years before the expected onset of symptoms. While there's a disclaimer here that the results may not apply to sporadic AD, that's added more pro forma than for any other reason. So here's the PET scanning looking at the carriers of the gene are up here, the non-carriers are down here. 0 means diagnosis, 10 years before, 20 years before. Certainly by 10 years before, there are obvious changes. The more things move from purple, which doesn't show up here too well, up to red, the more amyloid is deposited in the brain. So we can see that 10 years before symptom onset, there's already a significant difference in the amount of amyloid deposited here and here, and particularly up here, something called the caudate, compared with what you see in the non-carrier down here. The non-carriers didn't change over a period of 20 years. The carriers did, and by the time we get up to the red and the orange and the yellows, you're now looking at symptomatic disease. So this is one of the tests, one of the things that was done in this particular paper. There was a lot more that went on with it, but this seemed to be the easiest one to explain. So we know that this is a disease that takes decades to get to a point where it even becomes symptomatic. The genetic inheritance, there's a very good book by Stephen Post, Johns Hopkins Press, The Moral Challenges of Alzheimer's Disease. I think this is the second edition. And as he notes, the whole genetic question is still up for grabs. Family members are surprised to hear that, quote, the genetic test, unquote, is with respect to predictive purposes a myth, with the exception of the autosomal dominant forms, which are less than 1%. So we can't really predict, although you will see, or you eventually will hear people suggesting, get your genome scanned to tell what disease you're going to get. You're going to get ripped off. But a more important study on Alzheimer's is one called the Nun Study. This is the cover of Time magazine from, oh boy, I can't read that, the 14th of May, 2001. This is an elderly 91-year-old school sister of Notre Dame, who I will refer to as the SSNDs. 600 plus SSNDs agreed to a study that would involve annual testing of their memory and other tests, regular testing of certain blood tests, and upon death, automatic brain biopsy. The study's almost over now. There are only about 20 sisters living. This began about 20 some years ago. It's been on the cover of the news magazines twice. I have no qualms with that will help us to understand AD. The problem is how to prevent it. We don't know that, unless one chooses one parents very, very, very wisely. The book that David Snowden wrote about this is called Aging with Grace. It's a very accessible book about his relationship with the sisters and about the progress and what he found out through the study. The question is how does what we see under the microscope of the brains of the sisters relate to their symptoms? And some of the findings were shocking in that some of the sisters who had very extensive pathology had minimal cognitive problems, and some of the sisters with minimal pathology had serious cognitive difficulties. One of the papers that emerged from this that was published in JAMA sometime before 1997 was that the sisters who had minimal pathology but significant problems with their memories all had small strokes, one or two of them deep, no motor paralysis, but they had had some small strokes. Blood pressure, diabetes, that sort of thing. But he found a few other things, and this is where we get into the ethics of early diagnosis. When people learn they have a higher risk for disease, it sometimes leads them to assume they already have it, when in fact they don't. And this can cause people to live under a black cloud that they would rather not live under. And he gives a detailed description of one of the sisters who was misdiagnosed and for years lived in the fear that every time she forgot something or made a mistake, this was the disease, when in fact it was probably because she was distracted. So this is one of the big questions we're going to face as early diagnosis becomes possible. How accurate will the testing be? How much will it tell us about what is to come and when maybe it is to come? Only in the case of familially transmitted can we say with a reasonable degree of certainty. The question comes up, who wants to know? Huntington's disease is a rare, family transmitted, tragic disorder. It killed Woody Guthrie. His son Arlo was spared, his daughter was not. If you carry the gene for Huntington's, you express the disease at some point in life. I've had two experiences with Huntington's patients. In one, I evaluated the mother. The daughter, who was non-custodial, had been tested and was negative. The daughter who took care of the mother on a day-to-day basis, a lawyer, refused to consider being tested. In another, the mother was beginning to express symptoms of Huntington. She had three daughters in their 20s. Two of the girls were tested. The girl who was not tested and refused to be tested is also the one who just graduated from medical school. So the question is, who wants to know? And we know from the experience with Huntington's disease that fewer people at risk have been tested than was even expected, to say nothing of all those who might be at risk. And as Snow notes, to live in fear of a disease that you do not have and may never develop takes a tremendous toll. I don't think I even told this story to Mary Ann, but my first month in practice as an internist, which I did for 10 years in my dad's office, I was sitting at the desk. It was a lull in the action. And a guy walked in. He did not have an appointment. What the hell? I'm a Jesuit, I can say that. And I'll see my best friend tomorrow and he'll hear my confession. I make the joke the first time that I drove in Boston, I went to confession and the priest said, "You said what? How many times?" So that was only in 1 hour, Father. But this man came into my office. He stormed in, basically. He walked up to my desk and he said, "Your father said I had 6 months to live. That was 12 years ago. Who's dead?" And he stormed out. He had been bitter ever since my dad misdiagnosed whatever was going on. He did not give me any details. And now I had quit smoking 12 years before that, but boy, did I want a cigarette then. Whoa. So it can be a problem. What do we do with the technology that we have, and what are the ethics of the knowledge that we possess? Defining the Dilemma, again, Stephen Post, excellent book. Everyone has a 50-50 chance of getting AD if they live long enough. What good would come from testing when it can't help you make plans or when there are no preventative measures?